Obviously, I can't speak for one, many, or any Palestinians. That's a judgment each of them will have to make. And so I'm not going to pretend that I have any moral right to speak on that subject. That's a judgment they have to reach, and they may reach the collective judgment that it was a mistake. However, I want to just say in addition, not however. I'm not going to qualify the statement that I just made. Let me give you an analogy, okay? So let's take the case of the Warsaw Ghetto that was created by the Nazis beginning in 1940. So the people were confined in this ghetto, including my mother and father. They were in the Warsaw Ghetto. And it was clear after a certain point, not initially, but it was clear at a certain point that they were going to die. There was no question about that. At the beginning, there was skepticism about the rumors that Jews were not being deported to another part of Poland, but they were being deported to death camps. There was skepticism about that inside the ghetto. Actually, my mother told me this story. There was one woman in the ghetto who would shout from her window, "You're going to die. You're going to die." And people called her Cassandra, from the Greek mythology, the bearer of bad news. And my mother, in retrospect, said she realized that woman apparently knew something that we didn't know. Okay, come April 1943, the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, a handful, a small number, formed what was called the Jewish Fighting Organization. And then they engaged in a quote-unquote uprising. Now, the uprising has been vastly exaggerated in Jewish history. It was, by any reckoning, a very modest affair because they had no weapons. This was the Warsaw Ghetto. It had no real weapons. They had a few weapons. Now, were they going to defeat the Nazis? Was that a realistic prospect when the Russian Red Army couldn't defeat the Nazis? Was it a realistic prospect that the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto were going to defeat them? In fact, you can make the argument, I'm not making it, but I'm just saying the argument could be made. You can make the argument that the only result of that uprising, the only result was it catalyzed, sped up, accelerated the destruction of the ghetto. Because right after the uprising, the Nazis flattened the ghetto. So, having said that, I return the question to you. Are we then supposed to conclude that Jews should condemn the Warsaw Ghetto uprising because its only result was, as a material fact, its only result was the acceleration in the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto? So far as I know, no Jewish historian and no Jewish individual reckons the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in those terms. In the same way, I don't know of any African American who reckons the Nat Turner Rebellion as a disaster. Now, bear in mind, after the Nat Turner Rebellion, The whites, remember, it was the largest slave revolt in American history. The white population went mad, completely berserk. And they would seize hold of any black person in their path and kill them and torture them in the most brutal of ways. So, are we supposed to conclude that blacks should condemn the Nat Turner rebellion? Because the only concrete result was it unleashed the frenzied rage of the white population. I don't know of any black person knowledgeable about the revolt who reaches that conclusion. Quite the contrary, as I said, occupies an honored place in American history. So I suspect, I'm not out to sort of cut you down. I suspect there are many Palestinians now who regret what happened on October 7th. That's perfectly, plausible, perfectly believable. But I would say that historical judgments are complicated. And I don't want either to speak for Palestinians or to pretend that I know what history's judgment is going to be. The only point I made in my remarks is I can understand what happened. I once asked my late mother, I said to her, well, the Allies, the Western powers, they engaged in what was called the terror bombing of Germany during World War II. They were targeting civilian sites, hoping to break the will of the German population and eventually compel the German population to rid themselves of the Nazis. And I asked my mother, well, what do you think about that? My mother was a very humane, very decent person, for sure. No question in my mind. She didn't always act on her words, but her words were good. For that, I can say for certain. Her actions, not perfect, very imperfect, but her words were good. And she said to me, she just turned to me and said, and I remember it verbatim, she said, our view was, if we're going to die, we're going to take some of them with us. She just said it very flatly. If we're going to die, we're going to take some of them with us. My guess is, I can't prove it. I don't have the evidence. And when I'm speculating, I have a professional and a moral obligation to acknowledge its speculation. My guess is, on October 6th at night, those folks, those young men who breached the gates of Gaza concentration camp, each of them went to his mother, kissed his mother goodbye, kissed his father goodbye, because they knew they would never be returning. This was their last day. And then inside of them, they thought, now, tomorrow, I'm going to avenge those 20 years of torment in that concentration camp. And I'm going to avenge my sister who was killed, my brother who was killed, my nephew who was killed during those murderous operations, as Israel likes to call them. They're mowing the lawn operations. Do you realize what an utterly pathological society it must be to describe massacres inflicted on a concentration camp population as mowing the lawn? Can you even register that in your mind? And they then proceeded on October 7th to carry out a brutally vengeful act, for sure. Just as my mother said, if we're going to die, we're going to take some of them with us. That's how I read the situation.